Good morning and welcome everyone to the 16th meeting of the Culture, Tourism Europe and External Affairs Committee and our 7th remote meeting. I have apologies today from Ross Greer MSP, however I'm pleased to welcome Patrick Harvey MSP to the committee as a substitute member for Ross today. Our first item on the agenda is evidence of the impact of COVID-19 on the tourism sector. And can I welcome Fergus Ewing MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Tourism, Bettina Seisland, Deputy Director of Tourism and Major Events, and Duncan Mackay, Sponsorship Manager, Tourism and Major Events for the Scottish Government. Welcome to the meeting. I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning to ask your question and to provide an answer, and I would be grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. Before we move to questions, I would like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, everyone. I think it's safe to say that of all the sectors of society, of all the segments of our industry, the tourism sector has been hit the hardest of all in this pandemic, and it's impossible to overstate the problems that has caused for people in their lives and their livelihoods. The effect has been severe and pretty catastrophic. So we are dealing with an unprecedented situation this morning, Convener. Now, businesses ministers rather, are listening very closely to business. I spend the vast majority of my time engaging with businesses as groups, as individuals, in order to ensure that we are doing everything we can to help them through this pandemic. And that's why the package of financial support of the order of £2.3 billion has been invaluable to provide a bridge to mitigate the financial hardship that so many have suffered. But I'm very conscious that that job is not yet complete. And as Kate Forbes said on the radio earlier this morning, we do need to provide more support to more people to help them through this crisis. Obviously, the sector has been in dire need of positive developments. We all need to see hope. We all need to see light at the end of what has been a very long tunnel indeed. And therefore, I was very pleased to announce on the 10th of June to the Parliament in Holyrood that we planned, subject to the pandemic being brought under sufficient control, to reopen the tourism and hospitality sector from the 15th of July. And this, I believe, was broadly welcomed. Now, this approach, it's safe to say, it's important to say, doesn't deviate from the route map, but provides as much certainty as we could at that stage. There was further good news for the sector, as we know, yesterday when the First Minister announced that there would be relaxations of restrictions on travel and self-catering accommodation and other self-contained accommodation from 3rd of July and outdoor hospitality from the 6th of July, subject, of course, to the science being with us. Now, these measures, which unlock major components of our tourism and hospitality sector, Convener, have again received a warm welcome from the sector. I also wish to say that I've announced the establishment of a tourism recovery task force that will bring together many parts of the sector. It will meet this afternoon for the first time virtually. It will have just over 30 members across an extremely diverse sector. I want to say that I think it's important that this group do its work fairly quickly. I think we need to bring forward a number of measures sooner rather than later. So I envisage that it will be a short life working group. Guidance for the sector was published on the 18th of June. And let me put in record my appreciation to industry in particular for helping my officials in the good work that they did to get this guidance out to the sector, to help them make the necessary preparations for restart. And this sets out a risk-based approach and the core public health measures which will need to be taken to allow safe reopening, namely establishing physical distancing, including organisational capacity, queue management, signage and markings, enhanced hand hygiene measures and cleaning practice, advice on workforce planning, including training and equality issues, guidance for customers to ensure they know how to plan ahead and engage safely with the sector. And finally, Convener, I continue to engage with the UK Minister, Nigel Huddleston, and the colleagues from Wales and Northern Ireland. Although the discussion on this forum, which will next meet, I think, on Tuesday of next week, is turning more towards reopening and recovery, we are very clear with the UK government that we cannot divorce that ongoing consideration from the vital issue of what support the sector needs going forward in terms of direct funding, in terms of extension of the job retention scheme into next year in some cases, particularly with regard to the seasonal nature of so much of our tourism business, especially on our islands and our remote rural locations. I've sought to cover a lot of ground. I'm sure that we'll come back to each of those, and I very much look forward with my officials, Bettina and Duncan, to doing our best to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for that opening statement. Can I maybe go back to the points that you were making about your discussions with the UK Government Cabinet Secretary on providing that long-term support package for tourism and hospitality industries? Where are we on your request for reduced rates of VAT for the sector, and also something that was discussed with this committee before, solutions to insurance coverage issues?
Well, thank you, Convener. We have certainly raised the concerns of industry, the very long-standing concerns actually, about the impact of VAT and business rates. So we have raised that with UK government. There's been no direct response yet. I mean, I should say that these discussions are fairly constructive in tone. Nigel Huddleston has got a good grasp of the problems. There's no doubt about that. The discussions are amicable and constructive, and I welcome the extension of the furlough. I think we all do. So we really are trying not to approach this from the sort of workaday a status quo ante approach of partisan tribalism. Quite the opposite. We've got a real life catastrophe here, and it's evident to me that we really need to do more if we want businesses to survive. Nigel does, I do. So does everybody else. So where are we? I'm hopeful that the UK government will listen to the case for a VAT reduction. I think there's a very strong case indeed. Similarly, business rates has been a huge burden, particularly on hotels and pubs and clubs. I think for a long time there's been a recognition that they pay a particularly high level of business rates. On the business interruption, we understand that there is a test case going on. I have participated with Fiona Hislop in discussions with the Association of British Insurers. We, of course, wait for the outcome of the test case, but I really do think that the UK government could do a little bit more on putting direct pressure, perhaps from the Prime Minister himself, on the insurance sector to do the right thing. There must be, in business, a moral element as well as a purely commercial element. And in this crisis, I do think that the excuse the insurers operate that, well, we're not paying up your claim because this is the wrong sort of pandemic, just doesn't really cut it, does it?
No. And I think right across the political spectrum, we've all had mailbags full of instances of businesses that have been affected by that kind of attitude from the insurance business. So thank you very much for that. If I could focus now again on the Scottish Government's plans for recovery, can I ask when the recovery phase section of the STERG National Action Plan will be detailed, and will there be a commitment to implement the recommendations from Benny Higgins Advisory Group on economic recovery in the way that they are relevant to tourism, particularly Mr Higgins' recommendations, which were so ambitious, with a jobs guarantee and investment in digital infrastructure and that emphasis on young people?
Well, I mean, the answer, conveners, as soon as possible. We need to get on with this. Benny Higgins was very clear that in number one, in pole position, is our young people. and with more people coming onto the jobs market this year, as always, we do really need to provide them with hope, with a job, a training opportunity, a course in university or college. We need to provide them with hope. We can't see a lost generation in Scotland, and tourism has got a part to play. The faster, the better, the fuller the recovery in tourism, the better it will be for being able to help young people. And that's why I think Benny Higgins' recommendation that both VAT should be reduced and business rates should be looked at, those two recommendations that he made are so important. And these will be discussed in the task force, which, as I say, hopes convener to bring forward its own recommendations in fairly short order.
Thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary. And now move on to the Deputy Convener, Claire Baker, for her questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to first of all ask about the guidance that was published last weekend. Stephen Leckie was also on the radio this morning, and you'll be familiar with their argument that the 2 metres should be reduced to 1 metre to allow their businesses to be more viable. The guidance I thought was quite flexible. It was I suppose a route map, to use the word again, for the sector, but it wasn't specific in terms of what they need to do. So are you confident that this can be monitored and enforced, and that it will be robust enough for visitors to be confident that their safety has been protected? And finally, just an additional point you might be able to clarify is the guidance also didn't give clarity on access to facilities, to toilets. So you've said that outdoor hospitality will open on the 6th of July, but when will they know if they can give customers access to facilities?
Well, thank you, Claire Baker, for that question. And the guidance was, as I say, issued on the 18th of June. It was issued actually timelessly on the date that we said it would be, it was done. It was produced, Ms. Baker, after a huge amount of work with the industry, and in particular with Kate Nicholl of the UK Hospitality Association. I'd like to thank them, because behind our guidance there is the UKHA guidance for, I think, 8 different segments of the tourist industry. So there is more specific guidance for different types of premises. So when you rightly say that our guidance was overarching, that's because it was intended to be for the whole sector. But there is more specific guidance about, if you like, the nuts and bolts of, of self-catering, of visitor attractions, of hotels, of B&Bs. So I don't think there's any shortage of guidance. The second question was about the advice about toilets. Obviously, at the moment, toilets, public conveniences are not open, and that's because of the need to of the lack of capacity of social distancing. We do recognise there's a need to bring forward a clarity about that, and indeed that issue I've been raising with my colleagues just this week, and in particular prior to lifting of the travel restrictions for obvious reasons. So I would be grateful if I could perhaps refer to Bettina or Duncan in case they can provide a little bit more information on this matter, which is important and is in hand, but they may be able to provide convener a little bit more information on a very important topic.
Bettina, did you want to come in? Hello?
Sorry, I wasn't sure whether how the camera would be switched on. My apologies for that. I will come in on with regard to the toilets issue, which obviously is one that impacts on a lot of recreational activity. And currently, colleagues within Scottish Government are working on further guidance to ensure that toilet facilities in particular can be reopened safely. So I don't have a date for when that would be issued, but we can provide further written submission on that to confirm that work.
Claire is muted.
Okay, thank you. it's not the most edifying subject for a Thursday morning, but there have been complaints around, especially as you say, people are now out and about more and not having access to toilets is leading to complaints about some people's behaviour. So the sooner that is matched up to the proposal that beer gardens, etc., can open, that would be welcome. The other question I wish to ask was around the Pivotal Enterprise Relief Fund, which I've asked about a number of times, and while that is an overarching fund for all businesses, it has been proposed that it would benefit the tourism sector. We don't yet have the detail of who has received the money from that. I understand Scottish Enterprise are supposed to be preparing a list, but it is taking quite a while. And I have, as other members will have, received some concerns that it hasn't reached people within the tourism sector. So I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary can give some assurances about the support that's been provided.
Yes, sorry.
Hi. I was just inviting you to speak. Apologies.
Sorry, convener. Yes, it's a perfectly fair question. The Pivotal Fund has been designed to provide support in Scotland, and I think uniquely in Scotland, convener, grant support for those premises, those businesses that have premises with a rateable value above the threshold, which in Scotland is £51,000. We felt in Scotland that there were certain larger businesses, hotels, for example, major employers. They would tend to be larger employers who weren't actually getting access to the £25,000 grant for businesses with rateable values up to £51,000. And we felt that these businesses, in many cases, although they had access to furlough scheme, nonetheless have fixed costs which they had to meet. And the whole point of this financial hardship is to provide a bridge across to the other side. We felt a bridge was necessary. Now, there is no counterpart scheme in south of the border at all. And it's clear, convener, from the demand, the demand from the scheme across the three agencies that are administering it far outweighs the available supply of finance to meet it. I do know that a great many businesses have received help, and I believe that subject to normal rules about data protection, confidentiality, we will be as transparent as possible. That's what the First Minister announced in the very first statement she made, I believe, in COVID to the Scottish Parliament. That's what we want to be, subject to, of course, the rules about confidentiality. So I'm afraid we're not quite there yet because the applications are still being processed, Claire Becker. We are still trying to get the money out. We are still looking to see what more we can do if possible, because I'm acutely aware of the number of businesses, some of whom will be watching this programme, this proceeding today, thinking, well, that's all very well if you've got some assistance, but we haven't. What about us? So an awful lot of the time I've spent over the past few weeks has been to try to assist in the process of ensuring that support is provided. And I know this task is being taken very seriously by all three enterprise agencies. And indeed, I have my responsibility for the South of Scotland Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise. I have had numerous conference calls with them to try to make sure we do the very best we possibly can. But I would stress, convener, there is no pivotal fund in England. We are providing support in Scotland that, as far as I'm aware, has no counterpart at all. That's because we thought it was the right thing to do. And I profoundly believe that, and that those businesses assisted will be assisted to get across that bridge to the other side. That's the whole point.
Thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary. I now move on to Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I wanted to ask about the B&B Hardship Fund. I've still got a number of constituents who are having difficulty accessing that support, and they're being told by the local authority that they're not eligible on the basis that they've received, in some cases, quite small payments through the self-employed scheme set up by the UK government. I just wondered whether you were able to clarify from the Scottish Government's point of view if that was the policy intention, if people were to be denied that support on the basis of receiving small payments through another scheme. And clearly, the payments they're receiving don't cover the costs associated with their business, and wouldn't get them through to the point where they'll get bookings again.
Well, thank you to Mr. Mundell for raising that point. It's a very serious point. It's a good point. It's one that I'm familiar with. We want all B&Bs that are businesses. By that I mean that the operator, the owner, or the owners, typically it could be a couple, a husband and wife running a B&B between them, that if they're running it as a business and it's their sole source of livelihood and it is a bona fide business, not a hobby, not Airbnb, not a second home, then the aim, Mr. Mundell, is that they should get that help, that bridge, because they will have suffered because they have had no business during lockdown. So that's the principle. We found that the lack of a personal bank account was a problem. A lack of a business bank account, I should say, was a problem for some. So when we set up the hardship fund, it took that into account, and provided businesses could demonstrate that they were in fact a business by various formal means of tax returns and details of operations of business, they should qualify. However, I became aware that this particular issue was being raised by some businesses that had received money under the UK Self-Employment Support Scheme, and that was being used as a reason to deny access to 3,000. It does seem to me that there's a reasonable argument that if they received, say, £200 from that scheme, that they would have a case for the remaining £2,800. I've put that argument into the mix with my colleagues. We're working on that at the moment. I think there is a reasonable case, Mr. Mundell, for that. If you believe that's so as well, and those in other parties, then please pitch in. I think, incidentally, the median payments in the comparable fund down south is £2,900. So the sum of £3,000 is not huge, but it's a lot better than a few £100s. So thank you for raising this today. I do appreciate it. I think it's an important point. I don't think it's been fully dealt with, to be quite candid with you. I don't want to shirk the question, and I want to try to see if we can afford to sort it out. And in that respect, you know, the argument that Kate Forbes is making, that we do need a bit more flexibility in how we can spend our money, would be very, very helpful if you can use your influence and your family influence in the UK government. That would be very helpful.
No, I appreciate that answer, and I would hope that the money can be found. I mean, I think we're talking about a relatively small amount of money in this case, and I think that should be able to be found from existing funds. But I do agree that more support will be needed in the coming months. And really on that note, I wondered about another constituency issue, but I think it will affect other businesses elsewhere, but it's very acutely felt in Gretna and Gretna Green in my constituency. But that is, there are a number of tourism and hospitality businesses, particularly hotels, but also other associated businesses who are very dependent on the wedding trade. And clearly weddings are not going to go back to normal on the 15th of July from the route map, and would be on a much more limited scale. And it's whether the Scottish Government has any plans on that, or it is looking, and we've put a number of bespoke measures in place, but it's whether that's an area that you would consider for further intervention and support moving forward.
Well, I'll bring in Bettina Sizewell in a moment just to go over the detail of that, but suffice to say that you know, I do absolutely recognise that particularly Gretna obviously is associated with couples getting married, and that in general it's a hugely important part of the business, particularly of larger hotels in Scotland. And I'm also aware from discussions on this topic with hoteliers that many of them have bespoke function suites. In other words, you know, the reception is held in traditionally a separate area of the hotel, a conference or banqueting suite, or other facility which has its own facilities to it, toilets, kitchens in some cases, and the guests are self-contained, and therefore they're in an environment which hoteliers say they are able to marshal and steward with relative ease. They're not mixing in many cases, with the generality of the hotel. Now, this is not the case in all, but I do appreciate this is very, very important to the hotel sector, and it's also tied in, I think, with the 2-meter rule. Plainly, operating a hotel reception for, say, 200 guests may well be impossible at the moment with social distancing at 2 meters, which is the right the right position according to the public health advice we have at the present time, but which is being looked at by the First Minister fairly shortly. We all hope that we can see progress on social distancing as soon as it's safe to do so, but we cannot ignore the science for fear of a second wave of contagion. And we've seen worrying signs recently from all over the globe and down in Wales, for example. So as soon as it's safe to do so, then I do think, Mr. Mundell, that that it would then be much, much easier for hotels to manage and steward and marshal the operation of weddings and other events which involve people celebrating together in a fairly large numbers. But you know, we're working we're working very hard on this. But I wonder, convener, if I might bring in Bettina Sizewell again, just to see if there's anything that I've omitted in my answer to Mr. Mundell. Thank you.
Bettina.
Thank you. I think that our current route map says that in phase 2 we will allow marriages and civil partnerships and other types of ceremonies to take place outdoors with a limited number of attendees, and that it's during phase 3 that we will relax restrictions on funeral attendances, marriages and civil partnerships to beyond close family. So that will be continue to be under review, and as Mr. Ewing said, that this is constrained by physical distancing. So that's one of the major constraints to that at present. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can now move on to Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I was pleased to hear the comments about funding for bed and breakfast operators. I was received representations just earlier this week from a bed and breakfast owner who's not been able to access any kind of funding. So I mean, it is a real issue across the country. My question is actually about the guidance for self-caterers, and as we know, they should be able to reopen from next week. But one of the issues that doesn't seem to have been addressed yet is what should be done if a guest develops symptoms while staying in that type of accommodation. I mean, what are business supposed to do if they keep the guest in the property and it's a particular relevant issue in an island situation about accessing health services? I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I can, and I'm pleased that Ms. Wishart has raised this important question. If a guest who, after the restrictions are lifted, is in a self-catering property and considers that he or she has symptoms, then a test should be capable of being arranged through the local resilience group or GP. If the test is positive, then the individual should proceed to go home. The individual should not stay where he or she is. He should go home, preferably wherever his home in the UK may be, preferably in a private motor vehicle rather than public transport. The additional issue which Ms. Wishart rightly raises as an island MSP is that obviously there will be a need to get the ferry in almost all cases, and we have therefore asked the ferry operators to make arrangements to provide for isolation of any such individual, so that they can be separated from the other people, the other passengers on the ferry, and indeed the staff. That may dependent on the size of the ferry, because they come in all shapes and sizes, as I don't need to tell Ms. Wishart. It may be an easy thing to do, or it may be a very complicated thing to do, in smaller ferries in particular. But this issue was raised, and I've raised this with Jason Leach, and I think Ms. Wishart was on the call on Monday of this week when this issue was discussed, and therefore the relevant Scottish Government official shall provide the answer to the specific point about the ferry. But the general advice is, if somebody has the virus, is tested positive for it, they should go home. They should not stay where they are, whether it's in a self-catering property or after the 15th of July hotel or other types of accommodation. They should go home. Now, the business owner of the self-catering establishment must then undertake a thorough clean of the whole premises, preparatory to it being occupied by anyone else. So I hope that is a satisfactory answer from Ms. Wishart, and we will revert to her and the other island MSPs with regard to the specific answers of the particular ferries that operate for the Northern Isles, the Western Isles, and the Inner Hebrides.
Thank you, that is very helpful. My second question is regarding ferry capacity. And as you know, the ferry route between Aberdeen is treated by islanders as a main road on the mainland would be. So we're pleased that the tourism industry will be open fully from the 15th of July. So I wonder, in terms of ferry capacity, and obviously it's limited at the moment because of distancing requirements, does the Cabinet Secretary acknowledge that the island tourism industry might need a little bit more help, given that the access to the islands won't be as easy as without social distancing rules?
I do think that this is an important issue. I think that the businesses on islands may need a little bit more help anyway, actually, but especially because all of the challenges that businesses face in the mainland are exacerbated on the islands because of the complication of the limitation of ferry capacity because of social distancing. I very much hope that the science will enable us to find a more bespoke solution that will allow the capacity on ferry journeys to be increased. I know how important tourism is to islands, most of the islands actually, but in particular perhaps Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles, and Arran, and Islay, and Jura, and so on and so forth. I'm also aware that some communities are still a bit concerned about the reopening of tourism, and we need to address that and make sure that we communicate that safety is paramount, and there are various ways in which we will do that. So yes, we want to work with Ms. Wishart and the other island parliamentarians. We've now had, I think, 3 conference calls, convener, with island MSPs. The last one with Jason Leach kindly attended and gave very helpful advice, and we will continue that engagement. And I've also just yesterday asked, incidentally, that Visit Scotland arrange a session for all MSPs.
We seem to have lost the Cabinet Secretary. We will have a brief suspension until we can reconnect with the Cabinet Secretary. And welcome back to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee. We apologise for our brief loss of connection there. We're now delighted to resume broadcasting, and we were in the middle of a evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing, looking at the effect of COVID-19 on the tourism sector. And we now move to questions from Stuart McMillan, MSP.
Cabinet Secretary, One of the issues that has arisen throughout the COVID pandemic is also many challenges facing the coach operators. And I know the Cabinet Secretary has previously spoken to the committee about this and is very much aware of the challenges, certainly with that particular sector, and bearing in mind some of the coach operators do also many other tasks, including concerts and football matches and sports events, and also some will do some of the school runs. Has the Cabinet Secretary given any further consideration to a bespoke package to assist the coach operators?
Well, thanks to Stuart McMillan for that question, and coaches are an essential part of the tourism sector in the functions that they fulfil for obvious reasons. And I have engaged with the CPT and had discussions with some of their members and some of the leading coach operators operating the tourism sector in Scotland. And at the moment, there is no bespoke package for them anywhere in the UK. I have suggested to the UK that there should be, and I've made this argument with the UK government. The UK government have resisted this argument thus far. We in Scotland do have the Pivotal Fund, which, convener, we discussed earlier. That fund will have been open to coach operators and for those of them who are in that bracket. And it may be that some of them have received assistance from that scheme, but there's no bespoke fund. And that does leave us with a significant issue because, you know, the tourism sector is a jigsaw. If you have pieces missing from a jigsaw, it doesn't work. And my worry is that unless we can provide a bit more support for this sector, then it may not be there when we get to the other side. And therefore, whether it's cruise liners, whether it's rural hotels that rely on coach tour businesses with people coming in, Shearings was the example of business which part of the IHG group, which sadly announced its redundancies some time back, taking visitors who come to Scotland to play golf, for example, tours of people who want to enjoy the scenery or study parts of our ecology. It's just such an important part of the sector that I'm truly worried that we haven't found a way yet to protect them against, if you like, the COVID economic impacts, convener. So that is I'm afraid, a gap in the support. I do hope that colleagues on this committee and otherwise approaching this topic in a non-partisan way may join in our efforts to try to persuade the UK government to look again at this. And the last thing I would say is that coach operators are pretty highly leveraged in many cases, with having taken out loans to purchase the coaches, which may cost around about several £100,000 each, and that there are special finance houses that have been providing this finance. And I believe that without going to specifics, which would not be appropriate, that these finance houses are aware of the problems and are taking a reasonably sympathetic approach. I think that's all part of the solution as well, convener. But this is one of the aspects of the crisis that faces us, with which we haven't yet provided a satisfactory answer for everybody. So I'm grateful to Ms McMillan, who of course has championed the cause of marine tourism in Scotland and the cruise sector in particular, for which coaches are essential for taking passengers to visitor attractions when they land ashore in Scotland. If we're going to have a cruise sector coming back, we need the coaches, because the shore tours are an essential method of financing the whole sector. So it's all a jigsaw. We don't want the coaches to be the missing piece.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply, and I did pose that particular question because of a couple of local companies that I'm working with to try to assist. One of them in particular has managed to obtain certainly some of the the furlough monies, but the other one hasn't, as well as some other challenges. But it is very much certainly a Scotland-wide and also a UK-wide problem in terms of the coach sector. My second question, it touches upon once again that well, you spoke there regarding the marine tourism sector, but it's the issue regarding the furlough scheme. Obviously today, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance has been on the radio and also put the request to the UK government, certainly in terms of additional powers for the Scottish Parliament and for the Scottish Government, which clearly will be hugely important to try to get out of COVID, but also putting the request to the Chancellor regarding extending the furlough scheme. So if the furlough scheme isn't extended, then clearly it will just be a situation of wages will have been paid for a few months from that scheme, but with that challenge posed to that in terms of the economy, and as all of us are aware in this committee, the tourism sector is even more important to Scotland's economy as compared to elsewhere within the UK. And so, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of that, if the furlough scheme is not extended, notwithstanding obviously the task force that will be meeting this afternoon, but if the furlough scheme is not extended by the UK government, what negative effect and longer term negative effect do you think that will actually have upon employment and also upon some of our more challenged economies within Scotland?
Well, thank you, Mr. McMillan, for that question. And the first thing I would say is that what we wish to do now is to absolutely help the tourism sector as a whole make the most of this summer season and also see that it extend into the autumn. The more they can succeed on resumption, the better. The more business they can do, the better. And therefore, we have a clear duty working with industry to promote staycations, for example. With 3.5 million having holidays in Scotland a year, but 44 million people from Scotland having foreign holidays, baking on a beach somewhere, we hope that some of those 44 will instead have staycations in Scotland, have a marvellous experience here. But I think that's the first thing to say. We all want to see that the problem is minimised, that the success is maximised. But of course, the real problem in Scotland is that tourism is, I think, really significantly more important to our economy than for the UK as a whole. Secondly, the seasonality is such that many businesses, particularly in the islands and more remote areas, have a season which may last only from March or April through to September, possibly October. And therefore it means that the furlough, due to expire in October, will expire just at the very point when many businesses will have little or no business at all. Now, we want again to try to encourage and enable and use the government's influence to assist. But I do think that in itself is unlikely to be enough. And that's why the First Minister has suggested to the UK that a furlough extension is necessary. And if it isn't granted, as a question Mr. McMillan asked, well, I fear for the increased redundancies that will occur, particularly amongst the larger employers. Tens of thousands of extra people will lose their jobs in Scotland. Instead of investing for future success with the 2021 season, we see an awful lot of people go onto the redundancy lists, lose hope and faith, and perhaps not return to their former employment. It may not be available for them to return to either next year. And in a sense, if that were to happen, all the money invested in the furlough up to October may arguably have been wasted. It may have been in vain. So I do think that on a focused, partial basis, there will be a need for some kind of continued assistance. And that's because the state has told businesses, you cannot do business. The state has said, for the good of the wider population, you must shut your doors. Now, when the state says you can't do your business, I think it owes a moral duty to those businesses to help them for the consequences that that order has caused. And that's the whole rationale for the tourism sector in particular continuing to receive support beyond October. Welcome though that support up to October has been, as I said earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to Patrick Harvie, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to the witnesses. I wanted to ask about the furlough scheme as well, and it follows on fairly neatly from the questions that Stuart McMillan started with. And the Cabinet Secretary has indicated that the Scottish Government supports an extension to the furlough scheme for hospitality and tourism businesses and the particular impacts on those sectors. It's not just about the state telling businesses to shut their doors, but even once businesses start again, it's likely to be with a reduced capacity and therefore a reduced workforce. So in order to make sure that people's basic needs for an income are met, there needs to be some kind of extension or replacement. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could say a bit more about specifically, he's talked about something targeted, focused. What is it that the Scottish Government wants to see from the UK Government? Is it an extension of the current arrangements, some kind of replacement, something more conditional, or other details on what kind of scheme the Scottish Government wants to see? And in particular, we've already seen some major tourism businesses like Intercontinental Hotels in Glasgow and around the country already sacking people in large numbers, even though the furlough scheme is still available to them. So whatever replacement or extension comes in, how do we ensure that it actually benefits the workers it's designed for, rather than seeing them put on the scrap heap and businesses simply looking after their own bottom line instead of the interests of the workforce?
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Harvie, and we are absolutely determined to do everything we can to minimise the number of people that lose their jobs, to maximise those who stay in their jobs. And that's why I think, the first point I should just repeat, as I did to Mr. McMillan, that the duty we have at the moment is to really focus on, over the coming months, to maximise the success, all of us, to consider what we can do in having a holiday in Scotland, having a break in Scotland, and not just over the summer either. So we, if we can, through the marketing efforts to encourage staycations that Visit Scotland will do, through the marketing efforts of businesses themselves, generate as much success as possible, then of course we minimise the financial problems that the businesses face. However, it is undoubtedly the case that the recovery is not going to be complete. It's going to be slow. And therefore, the question is, what precisely are we asking for? Well, we're answering, we believe that the furlough scheme should be extended. The sooner that decision is made, incidentally, the fewer will be businesses that will make the decision to make staff redundant. In other words, the sooner the UK government can give clarification that, in principle, the furlough scheme will be extended, the less damage there will be, the fewer businesses, that large businesses in particular, that will feel that they have to issue redundancy notices for a number of commercial reasons, which are perfectly understandable from their point of view. So to answer the question, we think the furlough scheme should in principle be extended. In saying that, Mr. Harvie, I hope that it would not be a scheme that would be necessarily required by all businesses, but certainly by those for whom recovery is long and slow. And in particular, I think the large businesses, the hotel businesses in Scotland. And I fear that unless the furlough scheme is extended, then we will see many more redundancies issued, as I say, tens of thousands. And I don't make that as a political point, but one I think that we can all see in the offing. So the last thing I would say is that the Tourism Task Force will be looking forensically at all of these things and that task force, as I say, its first meeting is this afternoon.
Well, I'm sure that we all look forward to seeing more detail come out of the deliberations of the task force and the Scottish Government when they're able to put some more flesh on the bones there. Moving on, this is a sector as well with long-standing concerns in relation to workers' terms and conditions, extremely low levels of pay, huge numbers of people on the legal minimum wage, significantly below the real living wage, precarious incomes through mechanisms like 0 hours contracts and so on. The First Minister has said that recovery from this pandemic should be about building a fairer, greener and more equal Scotland. So what opportunity is there to ensure that recovery in relation to the tourism and hospitality sector actually drives up standards, levels of pay, and how well we look after the workforce, rather than seeing yet another race to the bottom in terms of standards? And in particular, what's the Cabinet Secretary's view on recommendation 9 in the Economic Recovery Advisory Group report, which is about conditionality, that government business support should be conditional on driving up standards, for example, building on the business pledge and fair work first. How can we make sure that recovery in tourism and hospitality is a period where we drive up rather than go through another race to the bottom on exploitative terms and conditions?
Well, first of all, the Scottish Government has long supported payment of the living wage, which I believe is £9.30 per hour ahead of the living wage, the minimum wage. As Mr Harvey knows, the power of regulation in this matter is reserved to the UK, but that's the approach we've taken, and we have also indicated that we believe that this is something that all employers should aim to do in respect of remunerating their staff. In particular, what can be done to best ensure the success and the capacity to make sure that the employees benefit as well as the owners of the business is to make sure that we assist tourism business in Scotland to overcome the major problem, which has been seasonality. The seasonality is the absolute heart of this, because you see, if a business has to make all of its income out of 6 months of the year, it's not going to be as successful as a business that can operate fairly successfully across 12 months. And therefore, one of the aims in tourism, and certainly when Fiona Hislop and before that myself, tourism minister, was to increase the overall success of the sector and try to extend the shoulder months and therefore encourage people to support tourism businesses across the year. The second thing that we do need to do, and I'm pleased Mr Harvey supports the Higgins report, is to look at how best we can well, he supports that part of it anyway. He can speak for himself, I'm quite sure, is to address the issue of the high taxation that is faced by the sector as a whole. I know that tourism businesses such as hotels, an increasing part of their expenditure has gone on wages over the years. And that's because I think a great many of them have done what Mr Harvey has asked them to do, what we wish them to do, which is to treat their staff very well. And we want all of them to do that. The best way to do that, I think, is to make sure that businesses can operate successfully and profitably in future, to do so for as long a season as possible, and that they don't face the levels of VAT and business rates, which in some respects prevent them from being able to increase the remuneration and terms and conditions of their staff. I think that's self-evidently true from a business point of view, and I used to be an employer and run my own business, and I think anyone who has done that will appreciate the difficulties, particular difficulties, because of seasonality in Scotland.
Thank you. Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Picking up on an issue that's been raised a few times now, and that is of the importance of people seeking to holiday in Scotland in the next few while. I thought it struck me yesterday, which was, of course, that it was very welcome news to hear, a number of easings of lockdown, in particular with regard to tourism. But of course, there's different dates for different things. These dates are imminent, and it would be, I think, really important for probably Visit Scotland to now have some campaign in advance of the more detailed campaign that I think is to be developed by the new task force meeting for the first time this afternoon. But to have something to keep us going in the meantime, because people can now start to book the next days, and it would be helpful, I think, for people to know exactly what is the planned opening of what when, because there was such a plethora of dates yesterday that it could be that for some people they found it a wee bit overwhelming and confusing.
Yes, well, thank you for the question, and you're absolutely right. I think we do need to take every opportunity to inform people of the options available, and I'm delighted that people will be able to, I'm delighted that, can you hear me all right, Convener?
Yes, I can, yes.
Right, there's lots of noise going on at this end here, which I didn't understand, but yes, we want people to have a holiday in Scotland. I think lots of people around the country will be champing at the bit and will, as we speak, be booking to go to a self-catering a unit somewhere in Scotland, or visit their own static caravan with their own self-contained washing and toilet facilities, or visit their second home, which they probably haven't been doing. And I've been inundated with people who want to do that. So I think most people will be self-starting. They will make their own plans, and they will be doing that right now. And I know from response from the industry that there's been an encouraging surge of demand following the First Minister's welcome announcement yesterday. But I think Ms Ewing is also right again that Visit Scotland need to continue. They have been promoting Scotland in a variety of different ways over these past 3 months. But now that there is more clarity, Convener, and now we are looking to lift the restrictions, and now the message is that we're doing this because it's safe for people to do so. Now is the time where we put the accelerator on the marketing of Scotland, of the staycation, and that's something that Visit Scotland will be doing, not just for the 15th of July, but right now, as well as reassuring communities that it is safe for people to resume having a holiday, provided they continue to act responsibly with regard to social distancing and respecting local people's needs and interests.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer, and indeed, I think the latter point is very important. Reassurance for the communities which will expect visitors, and reassurance for the visitors, and perhaps again for Visit Scotland to provide some concrete information in that regard would be very useful. My second question concerns the guidance that was issued, and I note, which I think is with regard to most guidance for all the different sectors, that it is as a matter of course to be reviewed for the next 3-weekly review, which I think is on the 9th of July. And I just wondered at this stage, leaving to one side the key issue of the 2 metre, 1 metre, which we expect to hear more from the First Minister next Thursday, I believe. But otherwise, in terms of the guidance, are there any issues already coming to the fore that may be subject to some change, or is everybody happy with everything, leaving to one side the other big elephant in the room?
Well, I think on the guidance front, that the guidance that we issued on the 18th of June was broadly welcomed. And as I mentioned earlier, there is, in addition to that, the industry have more bespoke guidance for particular types of property. Listening to businesses, and not only hotels, but pubs and clubs, obviously they've got quite a lot of preparation to do. They need to arrange for PPE, hand sanitizer. They need to arrange the sort of physical marking of premises. They need to arrange, if you like, a booking system in some cases. They need to train staff. There's a whole plethora of practical things from an operational point of view that we're aware businesses need to do. We work closely with them and try to provide any further information by way of clarity that's required. But I'm very pleased that, you know, on the 18th of June, we provided the guidance for the whole sector for the reopening on the 15th, but also that there has been, for the self-catering sector, you know, a couple of weeks notice given so that they can prepare their premises. That obviously involves a deep cleaning of their premises. That's absolutely fundamental to make sure that people have the confidence that a deep clean is carried out before they take occupancy of a self-catering unit on holiday. So, I mean, I hope that answers your question. It's a big topic. We're working closely with the Four Nations on this, with the Visit England as well as Visit Scotland. The Good to Go scheme, which I might be asked about, is going to play an important part. And as I say, I've asked Visit Scotland just yesterday to arrange a session for MSPs to discuss community assurance and the message to communities. And I've asked that facility of a conference call be arranged for sometime early next week, convener. And I thought it useful to mention that now for the benefit of colleagues.
Thank you very much. Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just to follow on from what you quaintly described your sister as Miss Ewing's questions. You talked about the issue of staycations and all the kind of issues that have to be addressed with regard to physical distancing, including organisational capacity, queue management, signage, markings, deep cleaning, etc. Now, the impact on that will obviously have to be passed on, the financial impact of that would have to be passed on to customers. Now, given that the Scottish Government is trying to encourage staycations, what impact do you think that will have on the cost of holidays, and will it price a number of families out of the market here in Scotland?
Well, I certainly hope not. I mean, additional measures, as Mr. Gibson says quite rightly, come with a cost. I would expect that the additional costs involved in most cases would be relatively modest, but in some cases might add, you know, £10 or £20 to the cost of a week's accommodation or something like that. I wouldn't expect it to be enormous. You know, obviously we want to try to be as supportive as we can to business in general. We've sought to do that through the support schemes, the Pivotal, the Creative Hardship, the Bed and Breakfast Bespoke Fund, the Rates Scheme, the Self-Employed Scheme for those who have not been employed for 3 years, and the UK schemes, the CBILS and the Self-Employed Scheme and the LCBILS. So all these, we've focused on that, but I'm also conscious that quite a lot of bigger businesses have spent a lot of money on making arrangements for social distancing and so on. And we are conscious also that, you know, if the social distancing advice indicates that it is safe to alter from the current position, and the current position, for the avoidance of any doubt, is that we should stick with 2 meters, because to move from that would create additional risk. But as soon as it does become safe to move from that, then, you know, the sooner industry knows, in a sense, the better, because they were then preparing for something different, possibly not a 2 meter distance rule, but possibly less than that. So we're aware, the First Minister is acutely aware of all these things, the need to make decisions as swiftly as possible, and of the impacts on business. But I am very pleased to hear the overwhelming welcome that businesses have given to the First Minister's announcement yesterday, and as with my announcement previously of the 15th of July. And I think it's salutary that almost all businesses that I've come across are taking this very seriously indeed.
Cabinet Secretary, and of course, as always, our island communities have great concern. And I'm delighted, of course, that Alistair Dobson of A Taste of Ireland has been appointed to the Scottish Tourism Recovery Task Force. Can I ask, though, with regard to islands again, there still is an issue with regard to the 2 metre distancing, which will have a severe impact on ferry capacity, and that's been taken on board by the Cabinet Secretary and First Minister. But what people are asking is, what additional support will businesses receive on our islands, and what scale will that be, and when will it be delivered, if at all? Because we know the Scottish Government is supportive and sympathetic and is lobbying the UK Government, but I think people want to know what the position is in terms of pounds, shilling and pence. And further to this, Patrick Harvie talked about furloughing. Patricia Gibson MP submitted a petition to the United Kingdom asking that with regard to furloughing, whether or not the 8 Westminster constituencies which have islands in them could have furlough extended specifically on islands, even after it ends elsewhere in the UK, because of the particular difficulties they have. That includes, obviously, Anglesey, Isle of Man, Scilly Isles, as well as Scotland. So I'm wondering if that is something the the Scottish Government would support.
Well, two questions. Take the financial support issue first. I do think there is a special case for the islands, because of the additional fact that to have a holiday in the islands, you need to get the ferry, and there are serious constraints there at the moment, and there's additional cost, of course, involved, and the season does tend to be shorter. So I think there is a case that Mr. Gibson and Mrs. Gibson have put and are pressing. Secondly, with regard to ferries in general, as Mr. Gibson knows, because he has been foremost in his advocacy for the island of Arran, for which tourism is essential, that we really do need to see a practical set of measures in place to ensure that businesses on Arran are able to operate profitably this season, and that applies to the other islands as well. It's absolutely essential that CalMac do this. This has been made absolutely clear. And I'm very, very pleased that one of the effects of the announcement yesterday will mean that those who want to go to Arran and other islands for self-catering, for self-contained lodges, for second homes, will be able to travel over before the 15th of July, because, my goodness, otherwise there would have been a real risk of a bottleneck on the 15th of July. That still remains, though, because apparently of the capacity that CalMac have said, I think Mr. Gibson will correct me wrong, but something of the order of 20% or below with social distancing. I think Stena, another ferry company, believes that they can operate with about 50% of capacity. Now, there may be practical reasons for that, I don't know, but what I do know is that it's up to us in public service, including CalMac, to find solutions. Find solutions we must. And as well as Mr. Gibson, Linda Johnson from the Achranny Hotel and Alistair Dobson from the Taste of Arran have been foremost in pressing this case for all of the businesses in Arran that depend on tourism, as well as for the residents in Arran, of course, who will absolutely need to be able to visit their families and travel to the mainland. And it's not only Arran, of course. These issues apply to a greater or lesser extent to all of the islands that we have in Scotland. So I think there really is a need to look at the interests of the islands specifically, and that's why we have Paul Wheelhouse as the Minister for the Islands, who's working with me very hard on all of these matters.
Thank you very much. We now move to Gordon Linters, who is our last member. And if members wish to bring in any supplementaries, please indicate to me in the chat.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you asked about coach operators. Now, as you'll be aware, some operators in Scotland operate a variety of contracts, including coach operations for tourism business, but also they run bus services, for example, for local school contracts. And I've had a number of operators contacting me about difficulties in getting payment on their school contract. runs from the local authority areas. So I'm just wondering what involvement your department have had in trying to assist these operators, because clearly that sort of operation can be essential to, or indeed both sides of the business can be essential to some of the smaller operators in particular.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lyndhurst, for that question. There is the particular responsibility for the operation of the school transport rests with Michael Matheson, my colleague, and I know that he's spent a lot of time working on this. And obviously, convener, all contractors to the Scottish Government, local authorities, are entitled to have their accounts and invoices settled on time, and indeed a lot of work has been done to ensure that payments of invoices are made not only within 30 days but within a very much shorter period. I think the guidance was for around about 10 days, I think, actually. And I just mention that because it's absolutely essential that businesses in Scotland receive prompt payment for the work they do for the public sector upon tendering of a relevant invoice that is in order. And therefore, any business that is not receiving that is quite entitled through their MSP or MP to pursue that. But I wasn't aware of this issue. It is primarily, I think, the responsibility of Mr. Matheson. So I'm sure, convener, that if Mr. Lyndhurst wants to give details to Mr. Matheson of any individual case, then that would be considered very carefully by my colleague, Mr. Matheson, and matters dealt with as appropriate.
Thank you for that answer, Cabinet Secretary. And I do appreciate that in effect covers sort of two portfolios. And so that's really, I'm interested just to know, and perhaps you could add a bit more detail as to how yourself and Mr. Matheson have been coordinating efforts to ensure that transport operators get through this difficult period, because as you point out, it's crucial for their survival that they can do so. And I wonder if you could just give a wee bit more detail on the coordination that is between yourself and him and the two departments.
Yes, of course. Mr. Matheson and I have had a discussion, a conference call discussion, as they all are these days, rather than a face-to-face meeting, but we have had a discussion about this. And following that, it was agreed that I deal with the tourism aspects. Many of the coach companies, Mr. Lyndhurst, that operate in the tourism sector actually do not also operate in the school sector, because there's different types of vehicle. The coaches for tourism tend to be of the more luxury end of the market, not least because very often they're transporting their passengers for longer distances than your average school trip, which is in most cases relatively short. So my understanding is that the businesses are, if you like, discreet in many cases, although not all. Every business is slightly different. So it's largely my responsibility to try and assist with the coach sector that operates exclusively in the tourism sector, and Mr. Matheson deals with the public transportation element of it, and that's the demarcation. We discussed it very clearly, and we also agreed our officials would work closely together to avoid any problems through lack of communication or dislocation. And I am pleased that at least in Scotland there has been some avenue for possible financial support through the Pivotal Fund, which has been, I think, availed by some coach operators. But as I say, convener, the main issue is the lack of a solution for them. I've asked for a further meeting with the CPT that represents the tourism sector as a matter of urgency. I think that meeting will take place very shortly, and no doubt we will come back to this issue in future, convener.
Thank you very much. We have a supplementary from Kenneth Gibson, MSP.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's just to do with an issue which hasn't really been touched on, and it's to do with the supply chain. Now obviously, tourism and hospitality are very much dependent on having an adequate supply of food and drink, but my understanding is that only 30% of our wholesalers believe they have a 50-50 chance of surviving the current year, and are looking to see what support they can get from Scottish and indeed UK government to ensure that they can survive, because without them it's difficult to see how the hospitality sector can perform as we would like it to do once it's back up and running.
Yes, thank you for that supplementary, Mr. Gibson. I've been engaging with the Scottish Wholesalers Association and Margaret Smith and Colin Smith, their representatives, on a very frequent basis. I think I've had about 4 conference calls over the past 3 months, and I'm also in fairly regular contact with Colin, and he will be a member of the task force. And the reason for that is precisely as Mr. Gibson says, that another piece of the jigsaw, the tourism jigsaw, is the supply chain. And without the wholesalers, where do the hotels, the pubs, the clubs get their food and drink? And moreover, many of the wholesalers, Convener, in Scotland are family businesses. If they go to the wall, they will be taken over. The business will be taken over probably by multinationals. So I'm very, very keen that we try to find that lifeline support for those that require it. There's a vast range of different businesses in the wholesale family. I know some have received support already. I know some haven't. And that is indeed work in progress. And it is absolutely essential that we have continued ability to provide supplies to our sector. Otherwise, they can't function as they could for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So we are on that particular case.
Thank you very much. Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener. Just as a follow-up to Kenneth Gibson's question, I'm aware of a wholesale business in Dumfries and Galloway that's struggling to access the retail and hospitality and leisure grant from the local authority because they don't feel that they're a retail business. But I wondered whether that was a issue that the Cabinet Secretary had come across, because clearly they're a hospitality business that supports other hospitality businesses, and without which there would be real difficulty in what's a large rural geography, to actually get these vital supplies out.
Yeah. Well, as I understand it, the categories of business which are entitled to the business rates relief included retail, and therefore those wholesale elements that have a retail facility would therefore seem to me to be eligible pro rata for the value of the rateable premises. That's a matter of each individual case. I'll be happy if Mr. Mundell wants to raise the case with me to look into it for him, although I imagine he's done so with the local authority. I think, to be fair to the local authorities, I think they've processed the vast majority of the claims that have been made from the figures that I've seen, and the vast majority of claimants entitled have received their payments. Their grant payments, but I'm happy to look into that and any other case that a member wishes to refer to me.
Thank you. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask, while we're promoting staycations, an important part for the Scottish tourism sector, there is a reliance usually on overseas visitors who bring a huge amount to our Scottish economy. If the UK government announce air bridges and arrangements with particular countries, what does that mean for Scotland? Do the same rules apply to us? And what does it mean for things like the guidance that's been issued to the sector? Would that have to be updated if it was to include overseas visitors?
Well, obviously, there's two issues there. I mean, first of all, to answer Claire Baker's question, I mean, we all hope that we can see the resumption of welcoming guests from all over the planet as quickly as possible, but that does depend upon the public health advice, and we have to listen to that very carefully. And I think it's not for me to make announcements or pronouncements about public health. That really is for the experts, and I should therefore not do that. But as a matter of principle, we want to welcome back visitors to Scotland. We're a welcoming country, and therefore that can't happen soon enough, as far as I'm concerned, once it's safe to do so. Secondly, I would hope that we would take an aligned approach with the UK insofar as we possibly can on all of these matters. They are being looked at by some of my colleagues in terms of the air bridges and the aviation issue. The airports in Scotland are absolutely essential parts of our local economy as well. They employ a great many people. They support a whole range of other activities beyond aviation in itself, and the services and the associated hotels that rely, if you like, on international travellers. So the sooner that we can safely see restoration of international travel to and from Scotland, the better. But, and there's the big but, is that the public health advice needs to be looked at very carefully. And I know that my colleagues in the COVID team are working on that with the UK, as is appropriate, to find safe solutions as quickly as they can be found.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, just a quick question regarding this year as the themed year of coasts and waters, which obviously will have been hugely adversely affected because of COVID. Is there a possibility that the themed year could be extended into next year?
Yes, I think that's an idea that we should be supportive of. I think the themed years are now on a cycle of every 2 years, so I don't think we would be impinging. Let me look into that. I think that's an excellent idea. Marine tourism is multifaceted. I mentioned cruise liners earlier, but there's also increasingly an important marina sector in Scotland. There's also a number of smaller cruisers. There's wildlife cruisers, dolphins. There's trips to places like St Kilda. There's angling interests, canoeing, kayaking, diving. As I don't need to tell Mr McMillan, because he has championed this cause for as long as he's been around, which is quite a while. But it does cover many, many facets that are part of the marine tourism sector, and our coastline and our lochs are some of the things that bring people to Scotland, because they are places of outstanding natural beauty, and as well as places where all these different types of recreation can be enjoyed.
Thank you. Now, if we can have a very quick question and answer, I can bring in Kenneth Gibson, MSP.
Convener, I was in discussion with one of my larger mainland hotels who say it'll take up to 4 years to recover. And the reason for that is that the UK government's soft loans, which have a low interest rate for this year, will actually go above the normal interest rate charged next year, which means they will have to pay a very heavy price in interest over a number of years before they can get back to normal. Is the Scottish Government in discussions with the UK Government with regard to extending these soft loans so that our hospitality and tourism sector can recover much more rapidly?
Yes, I can assure Mr Gibson that my colleague Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, is dealing with all of these issues regularly with the UK government and the fairness of the CBILS and LC bills terms. I know that a lot has been done by banks to assist businesses, but I also know a lot of businesses that feel they haven't been assisted by banks, or that the terms and conditions have been too high. Where the truth lies, it's not possible for me to judge at the moment, but obviously we work closely with the banks. And I know that from dealings with some of them that they have been working extremely hard and provided a lot of loan finance. But it's very important that the terms and conditions, particularly the interest rates, are reasonable. Not obviously now we have interest holidays, but when the interest rates kick in, it's very, very important that we don't see that the rates are punitive. I think if banks were to do that, I think it would leave a bit of a bitter taste, Convener. So I don't think it's necessarily in their interests to pursue that kind of approach, and I very, very much hope that they won't. But I'm very pleased Mr. Gibson has raised an issue of principle where, we do want all work to work together. Banks are necessary for the economy to function properly, but we all want them to charge reasonable interest rates and not excessive or usurious interest rates.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for that answer and for joining us today, as well as your officials. Before we move to the next agenda item, I will suspend the meeting until 11 AM to allow Michael Gove, MP, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, to join us. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome back to the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee. The next item of business this morning is an evidence session on the future relationship negotiations between the European Union and the UK Government. And can I welcome to the meeting the Right Honourable Michael Gove, MP, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Minister for the Cabinet Office, and Lindsay Appleby, the Deputy Chief Negotiator and Deputy Sherpa with Task Force Europe of the UK Government. We have around 1 hour for the evidence session today, so I would therefore be very grateful if questions and answers could be kept as succinct as possible. Before we move to questions, I would like to invite Mr. Gove to make a brief opening statement. Good morning, Mr. Gove.
Good morning, Joan. It's a pleasure to appear in front of the committee. I just wanted to say that in various different roles that I've had in government, I value the opportunity to talk to parliamentarians from all of the devolved administrations, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you very much. That is your brief opening statement.
That's all.
That's very welcome and very brief. Thank you very much. Mr. Gove, our committee in the course of this inquiry has heard many witnesses who have said it's vital that the UK Government extends the transition period if we're not to face the double disaster of a COVID recession and a no deal or a low deal Brexit. Last week you were asked about your government's refusal to extend transition when you appeared before the House of Commons Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. You told them that the reason the UK Government had taken that position is because staying in the transition period would mean continuing to pay into the EU without having a voice in the multinational financial framework that determines how we would pay. Is that still your position? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me, Joan? Sorry.
Yes, I can hear you. Could you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. No, I was going to say that the position hasn't changed. No, absolutely.
Right, okay. Thank you for that, because my understanding is that the withdrawal agreement is quite clear that the amount we pay is determined by a decision of the withdrawal agreement joint committee, which you co-chair. So not only then does the UK Government have a voice, it co-decides and ultimately it can veto any proposal, and that's stated very clearly in the withdrawal agreement, I believe in Article 132, paragraph 3.
We've been clear that right from the moment that the Prime Minister won the general election, that the basis on which he won the general election was that we would not extend our time in the transition period. Were we to do so, it would be the case not only that we would be liable to continue paying into the EU, it's also the case that the multi-annual financial framework would be set by the EU 27, not by us. It's also the case that we would be subject to new laws that the EU could pass without our input or say, and our ability to meaningfully put in place the measures which might help us to ensure that we have an effective recovery from a COVID-19 pandemic would be less. And I think it would be mistaken, foolish, perhaps naive to assume that in the withdrawal agreement joint committee, that if we asked for an extension, that the EU 27 would allow us to dictate how much we paid. I think that they would say, you want an extension, that's fair enough, but you are still benefiting, as they would see it, from unimpeded access to the single market and everything that goes with that. And so, just as you've been paying in during this transition period, right up to the end of the MFF in 2020, so you must continue to pay in. So I think that we'd be on the hook, as it were, for a significant sum.
Well, that is what you told the Northern Ireland Committee last week. I mean, if I could just quote Article 132, paragraph 3. It says, a decision of the Joint Committee under paragraph 1 shall A, establish the appropriate amount of the contribution of the United Kingdom to the Union budget for the period from the 1st of January 2021 to the end of the transition period, taking into account the status of the United Kingdom during that period, as well as the modalities of payment of that account. I mean, that seems to me, if you're co-chair of the Joint Committee, surely you could negotiate a good deal, given that the alternative would be to crash out with a low deal or no deal in the middle of a COVID pandemic.
I think it would be the case that we would be a price taker, not a price maker, in such a negotiation, because, as I say, the EU 27 would be agreeing what their budget was overall, and I don't think that they would say that we could have a discount membership. I think, as I say, that would be naive. So formally, of course, it's open to the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee, or was open to them, to agree that we should extend and then to agree what it is that we should pay. But as I say, agreement in that case, I think, would not be a process by which the UK would be able to determine price access, as it were. I think it would be one in which the EU would politely but firmly inform us of what our obligations were and invite us to agree to accept that price for continuing membership of or continuing extension, rather, I should say, of the transition period. And again, people can disagree about whether or not extending is a good thing or a bad thing, but it would certainly be the case, and for reasons already outlined, and which we may go into further. I think it would be wrong to do so, undemocratic indeed, but nevertheless, it would come at a price.
Well, thank you for that answer. I don't think we're going to agree on this. I'm just quoting what the withdrawal agreement says, which seems to give you more influence and power than you seem to think that you have. But we are tight for time, so I shall now move on to Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask a question around business preparedness. In a letter to the committee on the 9th of June, Michael Gove said that businesses will need to prepare for life outside, both at the end of 2020, and many have already done so. It would appear that some businesses have done this by relocating out of the UK and moving their head offices outside of the UK. And we did hear evidence from Ali Renison a couple of weeks ago from the Institute of Directors, who expressed concern over the level of uncertainty that businesses were facing. Given the very short timescale we have until the end of the year, how businesses are able to prepare for something that is currently unknown. She did also argue for a transition phase, an implementation phase that would be a formal stage that would follow from the end of the year, so starting on the 1st of January. Just if the Chancellor could, if the Duchy could talk a bit about that and how he believes that businesses should be preparing given the level of uncertainty.
Thank you, Claire. I think it is the case that in the first instance, we have actually seen a number of businesses which had been thinking about where they were going to locate both their headquarters and additional production, deciding that they wanted to reshore, that they wanted to have more jobs and to invest more in the United Kingdom. So we saw Unilever, which at one stage was contemplating moving its headquarters to the Netherlands, in fact say no, the UK is going to be the base of operations for the future. And of course Nissan on Sunderland decided that it wanted to reshore production in the UK. So we've seen a number of companies say actually the UK's future, notwithstanding the difficulties of the COVID pandemic, is bright in the medium to long term, and therefore that's where we want to be. And you make the point about certainty, which I think is important. And by making it clear that we won't be extending the transition period, there is a greater degree of certainty, I think, for business. And of course, it is the case that whether or not we secure a free trade agreement of the kind that we've talked about, a Canada-style deal, whether or not we secure precisely that free trade agreement, then businesses do know that we will be outside the single market and outside the customs union, and therefore, come what may, whether or not there is that FTA or we leave without that specific FTA, that businesses will need, for example, to prepare for new customs declarations and other processes.
As an addition to that, when will businesses know what the new custom arrangements are going to be? If we're looking at a 6-month period for them to prepare and they're still in the dark about what this might be, go back to Ali Renison's point, would there be an opportunity for a more formal, whether that transition period that would allow businesses to adjust to what the new rules might be, given they don't know what they are at the moment? And as a link to that, you gave evidence to the House of Commons Committee in April around Operation Yellowhammer and any preparations and analysis of economic impact on if we were to leave without a deal, which creates even more uncertainty for business. Could you respond to those points? And in talking about analysis, does the UK government do any analysis that is specific to Scotland and the issues that we face in specific sectors we have?
A series of important points that you raise. The first thing is we have communicated to business, and the Border and Protocol Delivery Group communicated to business a few weeks ago what the arrangements at the border would be. And of course, government always can do more in order to make sure that businesses and others are prepared. But the nature of the relationship that we will have with the EU, whether or not we get a free trade agreement, is clear, and the business requirements, for example, on customs declarations, have been made clear as well. On the broader point about the economic analysis, of course we conduct economic analysis all the time, but there are so many variables at play, not least because of the COVID pandemic, that it's important to draw a distinction between economic analysis and modelling and prediction. And sometimes people place an enormous amount of emphasis on models and assume that that model is a predictor of the future. It's not. But we do know that, for example, the Scottish Government has done some economic analysis of the impact on the fishing industry of being outside the Common Fisheries Policy, and said that being outside the CFP would, in their estimation, create thousands of jobs and millions of pounds of additional revenue. And that is certainly an analysis with which we agree.
Thank you. We now move to Patrick Harvey, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to Mr. Gove. When the JMC-EN was established, the UK government, in agreeing its remit, committed to work collaboratively with the other governments within the UK to seek to agree a UK approach to and objectives for Article 50 negotiations. It does seem as though instead of seeking to agree an approach to and objectives for those negotiations, the UK government has simply decided and then told the devolved governments what the situation is. Mr. Russell told us on 19th of May, the UK government published its legal draft text for the negotiations, which was shared with the Scottish government less than 24 hours before publication, with no opportunity to amend. So is it accurate that the UK government has shown no intention to agree a joint approach with the other governments of the UK and has merely imposed its own solutions? And if that's not the case, can Mr. Gove give us a list of examples where the UK has changed its negotiating position as a result of the input by the other governments?
I think it's fair to say that that characterisation is not wholly accurate. What we have done is that we've had extensive consultation with the devolved administrations in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. To take an example again, on fisheries, it is the case that work has been done with DEFRA officials and Scottish Government officials in order to make sure that the approach that we take on that uniquely important issue is one that takes account of the fact that the majority of fish that is caught and landed by the UK fleet is caught and landed by Scottish boats in Scottish harbours.
Okay, I'm surprised that's the end of the answer. It seems that Mr. Gove doesn't have a list of examples, or any examples, in fact, where the UK government has changed its position as a result of input by the other governments. I mean, this has led to a situation where both the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government refused to take part in the most recent ministerial meeting, an online meeting. They simply refused to take part. Isn't it the case that the intergovernmental relationship is fundamentally broken as a result of events of recent months and years. And what does the UK government intend to do differently, if it has any intention at all of repairing that broken relationship and actually beginning to share power properly between the elected governments and parliaments of these islands?
I think it's important to say that I don't believe that it's broken. Quite the opposite. There's been regular contact between myself, other UK government ministers, most notably the Paymaster General Penny Mordaunt, and representatives of the devolved administrations. And when we are negotiating, we do take account of specific Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Ireland interests. And again, on everything from thinking about the impact of a free trade agreement on the livestock sector, to considering how we can ensure that we maintain the economic equities of vital parts of the United Kingdom economy. We are negotiating in the interests of the whole UK. Of course, there are sometimes disagreements. You might expect that when you have people from different political parties and traditions in those conversations. So Mike, again, has a clearly expressed view on the nature of the relationship that he and others in the Scottish Government would like to see with the European Union. That's not the view of the UK Government, and it's not the view of the majority of people who voted both in the original 2016 referendum and who voted in the recent UK parliamentary elections. But I always benefit, and my colleagues always benefit, from hearing from Mike, Jeremy Miles, and others. Their expertise and insight is appreciated and, where appropriate, incorporated.
Thank you very much. We now go to Annabel Ewing, to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our guest, Mr. Gove, this morning. Picking up on some of the points just raised, we had a session with Michael Russell last week, and the picture painted was really quite different. Examples of the negotiation round details being provided to the Scottish Government only 24 hours before they started, lack of any information forthcoming from the UK Government about levels of preparedness and planning, no pre-briefs, no debriefs in terms of the various discussions in Brussels. And indeed, Michael Russell did say that, in his view, the Scottish Government and the other devolved governments were being treated as mere stakeholders rather than governments of nations of the UK. And he did, in answer to my question, agree that there was no respect agenda. And he did go as far as saying that it is now difficult to trust the people that he has to deal with. And so I would have thought Mr. Gove would place a huge importance on the issue of trust. And is he not therefore worried that this is the inevitable view that the Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary has reached?
I think it's fair to say that Mike always gives a good account of himself in whichever committee structure he's participating, whether that's in the JMC-EN or whether it's appearing in front of this committee. He's a fluent and effective advocate. That same fluency and effectiveness is brought to bear in our JMC-EN discussions and in other fora in which Mike and other Scottish Government ministers participate. And of course, we take proper account of the arguments that they make. But again, there is a difference of opinion. It is the case that the Scottish Government has a view on the nature of the relationship that the United Kingdom should have with the European Union, which is not the view of the United Kingdom Government. So inevitably, if you have a difference of that kind, then it will be the case that not everything that Mike believes the UK Government should be doing will be done by the UK Government. And so he is free to express his disagreement with us, and he does, as always, in effective, fluent, and precise terms.
Well, I think if Mr. Russell were here to speak for himself, he would say that he always advocates the Scottish interest and stands up for the Scottish interest. But turning to another area of concern, the area of bilateral trade deals, obviously there are many issues that are devolved to the Scottish Parliament, But notwithstanding that, there appears to be the same level of disengagement on crucial issues. We have heard of very, very serious concerns on the part of farmers in Scotland about the lowering of food standards, and indeed people of Scotland in general, about the lowering of food standards that some of these deals may entail. And all we have heard in response to these very deep concerns, I would respectfully suggest, are platitudes. And I would ask Mr. Gove, what trust should the people of Scotland place in the judgment of UK government ministers like himself, who is on the record as saying that it is wise to drive around for 30 minutes to test your eyesight?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that when we're looking at trade agreements, that we take very seriously the importance of protecting our high animal welfare and environmental standards. And your question gives me the opportunity to state that those protections already exist in law. We are not going to dilute them. The Department for International Trade engages with the devolved administrations, as do all government departments, when we're discussing free trade agreements. But when I was fortunate enough to be the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary of State in the UK government, I would regularly talk to colleagues Fergus Ewing in the Scottish government, Leslie Griffiths in the Welsh government, about making sure that we could have an approach which safeguarded animal welfare and put the environment at the heart of everything that we did. And I was pleased to see recently that the lead that the UK government was taking on the establishment of an Office of Environmental Protection and the adoption of high environmental principles was one that the Scottish government had sought to echo and emulate. And I think that that's been incredibly helpful. And again, I quite agree with Annabel that Mike is a very effective advocate, but I think that there's a distinction to be drawn. The Scottish government is, of course, rightly exercising a series of devolved responsibilities. But when Mike speaks for the Scottish government, he doesn't speak for everyone in Scotland.
Thank you. We now move to Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. During the course of our inquiry, we've heard a lot about fishing. Fishing is very important, as you've already said, to Scotland. I just wondered if you were able to confirm that it's the UK government's strong position that the United Kingdom should be an independent coastal state moving forward, and that's in strong contrast to what we hear from the Scottish government, whose position would leave Scottish fishermen trapped in the common fisheries policy.
You're absolutely right, Oliver. One of the benefits of being outside the European Union is that we can have full control of our exclusive economic zone. That means that we can decide who fishes in our waters and on what terms. At the moment, because of the nature of our accession to the European Union in the 1970s, it's the case that in that exclusive economic zone, other countries have significant access to our waters. We want to make sure that we are an independent coastal state, exactly as you say, so that just like Norway, Iceland and the Faroes, we can allow others in, but on our terms. That means, as we touched on earlier, as the Scottish government's research has shown, that will be more jobs and more money for Scotland's coastal communities, particularly but not exclusively in the northeast of Scotland. And it also means that we'll be able to manage stocks in a more environmentally sensitive way. So it's a win-win, economically and environmentally. And you are right that the logic of the Scottish government's position of wanting us to remain within the European Union would mean that we would be in the common fisheries policy. And if at some future date, and I hope it doesn't happen, but if at some future date there were an independent Scotland and that independent Scotland wanted to accede to EU membership, it would have to accept the common fisheries policy. Scotland would lose control of its territorial waters, and of course, under current terms, Scotland would also have to agree to join the single currency, and that would create additional economic turbulence, not just for coastal communities, but across Scotland.
Thank you for that response. I think Scottish fishermen will be pleased to hear the UK government's going in to fight for that prize that Brexit delivers. I also wondered, you've talked already about the political differences between the Scottish and UK government on Brexit. But over 1 million people, as you know, voted to leave the EU and Scotland. And do you share my concern that the Scottish Government tries to present staying in the customs union and staying in the single market as Brexit? I don't think that's what those people voted for. And do you just recognise that there is just an impasse there that where a compromise couldn't be found?
That's very fair. I mean, again, the Scottish Government's position is well known, well rehearsed, and presented, as I mentioned, by Mike and others very clearly. But it does run counter to the clearly expressed commitment in the EU referendum to leave the customs union and the single market, and indeed many of those who were arguing that we should remain pointed out that leaving would mean that we would leave the customs union and the single market. David Cameron and others made that clear. And you are right, 1 million people, 38% of the population of Scotland voted to leave. And I think it's important that when the Scottish Government presents a case on behalf of the people of Scotland, that it takes account of the views of those people, because their decision was taken in a considered fashion, and the Scottish Government should seek to represent their views to the best of its ability.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan, followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Gove. I'd like to go back to Patrick Harvey's question a few moments ago when he asked about ways that Scottish Government have successfully influenced the development of UK policies. Could you provide the committee with 5 examples of where each of the devolved administrations has successfully managed to get the UK government to actually change its policies and change its maybe some of the negotiating tactics for Brexit?
Well, I think that it's important to recognise that the JMC-EN and indeed in the negotiations take place in an environment where there is give and take, and it may well be the case that both during those negotiations, and because of their sensitivity, they're inevitably conducted in private, that during those negotiations there is inevitably give and take as different positions are tried out to see whether or not there might be movement, and it's always best in those negotiations to make clear that there's flexibility. But the whole point of the JMC-EN is that it's a private discussion, and the whole point about our negotiating stance is that we shouldn't negotiate in public. That's not how international negotiations do take place. What I can say is that if we think about everything from, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland rely to a greater extent in agriculture on livestock production than England does, if we take account of the fact that there are specific equities that Scottish producers have, again, in the agri-food sector because of the prominence of geographical indicators, if we take account of the fact that the Scottish Government has said that access to the Erasmus programme is something to which they're strongly attached, if we take account of the fact that the Northern Ireland Protocol and its implementation has to take account of the specific legacy of the Belfast Agreement, if we take account of the fact that as we look again at Wales's economic future, we need to be certain that sectors like not just agri-food, but also manufacturing have the right deal. All of these are areas where our negotiating stance is shaped and framed by determination to do the best for the United Kingdom. And of course, in doing that, we're listening to the Scottish and Welsh governments and the Northern Ireland executive. But of course, from time to time, our judgment about what might be in the interests of the whole of the UK differs from that of, say, the Scottish Government or the Welsh Assembly Government. But that is, of course, because the party traditions and the political philosophies of different politicians, while it's always good if they overlap, do inevitably diverge in certain circles.
Shaped and listening to doesn't indicate actually being amended or fulfilling any of the suggestions. But certainly I'd be grateful if you could write to the committee with specific examples, because as you quite rightly said, these negotiations are taking place privately, not in public, quite rightly. So it would be very useful for us to actually have that particular detail. But you did mention Erasmus there, Mr. Gove, and I've got a question specifically on that. And I will make you aware that I studied through an Erasmus scheme beforehand, so I genuinely know how important the scheme is. You'll be aware that Scotland benefits disproportionately from participation in the EU programmes such as Erasmus Plus and also the Horizon 2020 programmes. And these particular programmes are of huge importance to this committee. In your recent letter to the committee, you stated that the UK government is, and I quote, considering participation in the next generation of these, including Horizon 2020 and Erasmus Plus, which are due to begin in 2021 and are currently under negotiation, where it is in the UK's interests, we are open to participating in some EU programmes, including elements of Erasmus Plus, on a time-limited basis, provided they are in line with UK interests and we can agree a fair and proportionate financial contribution. In the same letter, Mr. Gove, the Scottish and Welsh governments also requested, and I quote, confirmation that in the negotiations on participation in EU programmes, the UK government will respect the devolution settlement by asking for, where appropriate, the option for devolved administrations to continue participating even where you have decided on behalf of England not to do so. So how do you respond to this request from both the Scottish and Welsh governments?
Some very important points that you make there, Stuart. On the first one, about listing, I think it's important that I refer to the Ministerial Code. Paragraph 2.3 of the UK Government Ministerial Code says that the internal process through which decision has been made should not be disclosed. Neither should the individual views of ministers or advice provided by civil servants as part of that internal process be disclosed. And that's in order to have a safe space for discussion. So I've mentioned a number of areas where we've taken account of the specific interests of the devolved administrations, and more particularly the people within Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But I don't think it would be right. I can understand it's a perfectly legitimate question, but I don't think it would be right to give a blow-by-blow account of the discussions that do take place. That would run counter to good practice in policy making and the need to have a safe space for these discussions to take place and for advice to be offered. On the point about a programme like, oh, sorry, you come back, yes.
I wasn't asking for a blow-by-blow account.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand, but I'm explaining the context. On the point about...
you move on quite quickly, so it's just 2 questions per member.
On Horizon and Erasmus, the important thing is for the UK's involvement in any EU programme, we need to make sure that it is value for money. And one of the things that we do know is that Scots universities, because of their excellent research base, benefit particularly from involvement in the UK-wide allocation of research funding. As in so many ways, Scotland benefits financially from being within the United Kingdom because of the strength of the UK Treasury and its institutions. So we'll look at future participation in Erasmus and in science programmes. We hope that we will be able to participate in them, but it does need to be value for money. One thing that is unambiguously value for money is Scots universities having access to UK research.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Gove. Operation Yellowhammer was alarming reading, and I wondered if you believe those warnings still apply in the context of a no-deal scenario. Might those warnings be worse now, given all that businesses and governments have had to deal with in the last 6 months? And are there particular areas that might be more vulnerable now than they were, say, 6 months ago? For example, supply chains. And actually, what is the status of Operational Yellowhammer now?
Well, Operation Yellowhammer was specifically set up in order to deal with a no-deal outcome. Now, we do have a deal, the withdrawal agreement, and that means that some of the questions which would have been unresolved if we hadn't secured that withdrawal agreement are now resolved. The position of Northern Ireland through the Northern Ireland Protocol, the rights of EU citizens in the UK, and so on. Now, of course, you are absolutely right to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has created difficulties for citizens and businesses across the United Kingdom. But we believe that the most important way in which we can help businesses and help citizens is providing certainty about the end of the transition period and using the strength of the UK exchequer to underpin an economic recovery.
Answer, can I move to citizens' rights? The coronavirus shone a light on the enormous contributions EU make to public services, our economy, our society. And the lockdown has meant that the closure of scheme support centres, local scanning centres, etc., has made it more difficult for EU nationals to apply for the ID needed to make applications. The Home Office claimed that they would be able to ensure that every EU citizen has settled status by next year. Do you think that's credible? And should the deadline for the settlement scheme be extended to take account of the impact of COVID-19?
It is credible. I don't see any reason to extend that deadline halfway through next year. And I think it is the case that some 3.2 million EU citizens in the UK have applied for settled status. That's more than we actually imagined were the number of EU citizens in the UK. It was widely believed to be around 3.3 million rather than 3.2 million. And you are right. The presence and the participation of EU citizens in the life of the UK is a good thing.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Gove. I'm just wondering, Mr. Gove, if you can explain how law enforcement and security provision will be enhanced by the end of transition.
Well, I think it is the case that when we take back control of our borders, that we will be able more effectively to decide who comes into our country and on what terms.
So things like the European arrest warrant and things like that, cooperation with European police and security organisations, you actually think that will actually improve, do you, in terms of delivery of the efforts to impact on organised crime, smuggling, etc.? You seriously trying to suggest that will actually be the case? And if that is the case, does that mean that all this cooperation in recent years with Europe has been detrimental to the UK?
Well, it's important to recognise that, for example, when it comes to security and intelligence cooperation, that is done on a nation-state to nation-state level. It is a nation-state competence. And we have a number of tools and areas in which we freely cooperate with our European neighbours and indeed also cooperate with other countries outside the EU in order to keep our citizens safe.
Could we unmute Mr. Gibson? Mr. Gibson, could you repeat your question?
Oh, apologies. Can I ask, with regard to financial services, Glasgow and Edinburgh alone employ 62,000 people in financial services, worth £6.3 billion in exports last year. I'm just wondering again how the ending of transition will actually benefit this key sector, given that the CBI has said that the overall economy will shrink by 3.5% in the first year of the end of transition. And I'm thinking particularly about sectors like life insurance, where Scotland has 24% of the UK's entire employment in this sector, and of course the loss of the benefits of passporting.
You're right that financial services matter a great deal to the economy of the United Kingdom and Scotland, and I should say that it's not just Edinburgh and Glasgow. In Perth and Aberdeen, indeed across Scotland, there are people employed in financial services. It's also important to recognise that the EU should grant equivalence to the UK when it comes to financial services. That's an autonomous EU decision. It's not something that is subject to negotiation. But it's also the case that a number of voices in financial services have said that the ability of the UK to thrive outside the single market is greater. It's important that we are not a rule taker when it comes to making sure that we have the right regulatory and legal framework for the success of the financial services sector.
Thank you. Gordon Lyndhurst.
Thank you, Convener. Mr. Gove, we've seen in the current pandemic how important many key workers are in different areas, including the NHS and so forth. And some of these workers are not necessarily currently paid at levels that many might think appropriate to the importance of the work that they do. And I think we've seen, as I say, in the current pandemic, this emphasised. Now, in Scotland, as in many parts of the United Kingdom, those who work in tourism, the care sector, or indeed seasonal agricultural workers might be thought to fall into this category of people who are essential, but perhaps at the lower paid end of the scale. And when I was on the Economy Committee in the Scottish Parliament, we heard evidence from a number of Scottish companies about some of the issues, and often they would say that they couldn't actually remember when they last tried to recruit workers within Scotland, in spite of there being lots of unemployed and indeed unemployed younger people. And it seemed that it was simply easier to simply bring workers in from the rest of the European Union at lower paid rates. Now, the Secretary of State for Scotland, when he gave evidence to this committee, said that he hoped that as a result of us leaving the EU, we would see a rise in wages for people who are lower paid so that their work would be properly remunerated. How do you see this developing going forward?
Point, and I completely agree with the Secretary of State. One of the features of economic analysis that was highlighted during the referendum and subsequently is that while immigration is vital and valuable, it is the case that uncontrolled migration in certain areas can depress the wages of some workers. And there have been a number of very important thinkers on the left, like the Labour PM Maurice Glassman and the Fire Brigade Union ex-official Paul Embury, who have made that point very clearly. So the Secretary of State is right, and I think you're right as well, Gordon, that one of the things that we do need to look to in the future is making sure that all work is properly valued, and that people who may not have been paid as they should have been paid in the past enjoy the opportunity to see their earning power increase.
Thank you for that answer. And I know that, and you'll be aware that, of course, training and education skills programs and that are, of course, devolved. But are there other examples from other areas of the United Kingdom that we can look to see in terms of approaching this issue now that we are out of the EU and indeed after the transitional period is over?
Yes, I think it's a very, very good point. And I think one of the things that I would like to see and to encourage is the adoption of good practices from different parts of the United Kingdom in the education and training sector. And I know that whether it's the apprenticeship levy or whether it's looking at giving more day-to-day control over schools to head teachers and professionals, there is good practice that we can all share, and I think it's critically important that that we do so, because you're absolutely right. One of the ways in which we increase productivity overall as a country is by improving education alongside infrastructure. And one thing that I think that would be beneficial overall would be to make it easier for students from every part of the United Kingdom to study in other parts of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gove. We have a little time in hand, which is great. Thank you to Mr. Gove and to our questioners. Can I return to your appearance before the House of Commons Northern Ireland Committee last week, Mr. Gove? You said that businesses in Northern Ireland will, as has been recognised because of the protocol, have certain advantages that businesses in other parts of the UK may not enjoy, whether or not we have a free trade agreement. I represent the south of Scotland, and obviously businesses, that includes Dumfries and Galloway in the southwest of Scotland, which would see Northern Ireland businesses as often as their direct competitors. What words of comfort do you have to them, given that you're saying that Northern Ireland businesses will have an advantage over these Scottish businesses?
all of us recognise the gains that have been made in the last 22 years as a result of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. All of us, I think, would want to make sure that Northern Ireland continues to prosper. I think it's the case that if we look at Scotland's history, the ties of affection and respect between citizens of Scotland and citizens across the island of Ireland, including Northern Ireland, are strong. We don't we don't make ourselves stronger by pulling others down. So standing in solidarity with the people and the businesses of Northern Ireland, making sure that they can build on the successes that they've had over the last 22 years is something that I think that Scots would want to do. And it's certainly the case that if Northern Ireland businesses are succeeding, then that means that the trade that plies from Larne to Cairnryan, and which benefits people in Dumfries and Galloway, can continue to flow freely. And I think that's good for all of us.
Yeah, I think people in Scotland and in Dumfries and Galloway in particular do have strong paternal ties with Northern Ireland and wish them very well. But that doesn't mean to say that they want to be put at a competitive disadvantage.
Businesses in Scotland enjoy a number of competitive advantages as a result of being part of the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland businesses have unfettered access to all of the UK. Scotland's businesses, Scotland's consumers benefit from the strength of our UK internal market. If that internal market were to be fractured, then that would be the greatest competitive disadvantage that Scotland's businesses could be faced with. And that's why I think that the Northern Ireland Protocol, the commitment to unfettered access for Northern Ireland goods, and the strength of the UK internal market overall give all businesses confidence and a competitive edge.
We have another supplementary from Stuart McMillan.
Thank you again, Convener. Mr Gove, the WTO are suggesting that anything between there'll be a 13 to 30% fall in world GDP in 2020. And on the 4th of June, when Philip Rycroft appeared in front of this committee, part of the discussion centred around the 2018 modelling that he was part of for the UK government at the time. And Mr Rycroft quoted just on the day, and I'll say it now, it's the modelling, 2018 modelling did not accommodate at all, because of course it could not have done, was the impact of the coronavirus on macroeconomic conditions, around which I absolutely accept that there are huge uncertainties. With this being the case and the challenges that we are going to face economically, do you therefore not agree that it would be wise to therefore look at some of the financial frameworks that are in place, particularly that between the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament and the UK that was signed in 2016, because clearly the macroeconomic conditions changed somewhat?
I think there are two important points there. I think the first thing is, as Philip very helpfully and graciously acknowledged, the whole point about economic models is that they cannot accurately predict the future. The famous unknown unknowns will always occur. But within that, one of the ways in which we can most effectively safeguard the prosperity of the United Kingdom is, as I was touching on with Joan earlier, making sure that we have effective working across the UK, and that we have a strong and free-flowing internal market.
Thank you. We have a supplementary from Kenneth Gibson, MSP.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. Clearly the pandemic has hampered negotiations, and I'm just wondering if there will still be negotiations outstanding by the end of October, and if so, what areas of the UK economy will struggle as a result of being unable to conclude negotiations this year and the lack of an extension of transition.
We had a high-level agreement just the other week with the Prime Minister talking to President Ursula von der Leyen, President David Sassoli and President Charles Michel, and it was agreed that we would accelerate the pace of negotiations, in the phrase that was used, put a tiger in the tank, and that is why the pace of negotiations is picking up. because there's a determination on all sides to ensure that we can make progress.
Thank you. Annabel Ewing, MSP.
Thank you, Convener. It was mentioned a wee while ago about the folk in Scotland who chose to vote no in 2016, and that indeed is the case. Some did, but 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU. All recent studies have shown that the forcible removal of Scotland from the single market and the customs union will be hugely damaging for the economy of Scotland. So my question to Mr Gove is, people didn't vote to become poorer. Why do you want to make my constituents of Cowdenbeath poorer?
The last thing I would want to do is to make people in Cowdenbeath or anywhere in Fife poorer. I'm in politics in order to spread prosperity and to generate greater equality of opportunity. One of the things, though, that would make people in Cowdenbeath and Fife poorer would be if Scotland were to leave the single market and the customs union of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Did you want to come back, Annabel?
To say, it's utter nonsense. And the thing is, and going back to the key issue of trust, the question I first raised with Mr Gove, the key issue of trust these days in politics, people hear these tired messages and they just don't believe you guys anymore, I'm afraid, Mr Gove. They don't really believe you.
Well, again, I think it's unambiguous that I don't know anyone really who would contest it, that if Scotland left the United Kingdom, that it would be poorer. Andrew Wilson, a gifted economist, in the Growth Commission report that was commissioned by the First Minister, pointed out that Scotland would undergo additional austerity as a result of independence. Now, it's a perfectly, obviously legitimate view held by people like Andrew and others that is a price worth paying. But I think that Andrew's work draws attention to some of the weaknesses in the white paper that was published by Alex Salmond when he was First Minister, making the case for independence. And I think when we talk about trust, and I do take your point very seriously, we improve trust in politics when we are honest about trade-offs. And I think that Andrew's work, including, I think, on the radio last week, saying that an independent Scotland faced particular economic challenges, would face particular economic challenges as a result of COVID. I think that sort of candour helps rebuild trust, and I think that the approach that he has taken in spelling out the price of breaking up the United Kingdom, that sort of candour is helpful in the debate.
Thank you. We have another question from Claire Baker, MSP Deputy Convener.
Thank you, Convener. If I just go back to the issue of the withdrawal agreement and the current negotiations. So before the general election, the political declaration was agreed with the EU, and I do accept that was non-binding. But I think, I was someone who wanted us to remain within the EU, and I'd still rather see us within the EU. However, the political declaration, I think, did give possibly a broader interpretation of what the relationship could be like that would maybe get broader support across the UK. The UK government seemed to have moved quite a bit from the content of the political declaration in the recent negotiations. Do you think what is left of the political declaration that is relevant? Is it still it no longer appears to be the basis for the negotiations, which it was intended to be?
It is very much. It provides a framework for the negotiations, and it allows us to reach what I hope will be a mutually beneficial free trade agreement. So the political declaration certainly does act as the framework. And you are right; it allows for a variety of different levels of relationship and agreement, but it's definitely the framework, the foundation on which the negotiations are conducted.
Thank you. We have another question from Kenneth Gibson. If we could keep it as brief as possible, and then we'll make our deadline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Gove. I don't recall any Conservative politician praising Andrew Wilson when he was an SNP MSP. Is it not the case that he, like 54% of Scots, believes in independence because we know Scotland will be a more prosperous, just and equal society when Scotland is indeed an independent nation once again?
Well, again, Andrew's view is clear. I have great respect for him, but I think it's also clear, as the Growth Commission report pointed out, that Scotland would undergo greater austerity if it were independent. Scotland has, if it were independent, would have the biggest deficit of any country in Europe. That economic pain and turbulence, some might consider to be a price worth paying in order to secure the goal of independence, and that's fair. And I think that Andrew's candour in that respect is helpful. And as I say, the publication of the Growth Commission made clear that some of the claims that were made in the independence white paper that was produced in the 2014 referendum were perhaps over-optimistic. I think if you look back at that white paper and look, for example, at some of the projections that were made on the price of oil, and what that would do for Scotland's economy, I think we can show that those predictions, if not heroic, were certainly at the optimistic end. And I think that the greater degree of proportion and candour that Andrew's brought to this argument is helpful. Of course, I don't agree with him on every aspect of it, but I do think that some of these difficult truths that Andrew has helped to surface and enable us to grapple with allow us to look more clearly at the economic cost of separating Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's not just an economic cost. I also think that it undermines the principle of social solidarity, which is such an important part of the United Kingdom's history as well. My view is that folk in Scotland, like people in Northern Ireland, Wales and England, have the same values of social solidarity, and it's important that we uphold those values across all parts of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. We do have 3 minutes in hand. If I could just quickly ask Mr. Gove before we finish up, again returning to the Northern Ireland Protocol in the southwest of Scotland, if we don't get a deal, where will the checks take place between Scotland and Northern Ireland, and where will the infrastructure be built to do those checks?
There's no need for any infrastructure in Scotland because it is the case that Northern Ireland businesses will have unfettered access to the UK internal market. It is the case that there'll be some additional requirements on checks on products of animal origin because we're respecting the island of Ireland's status not just as a single epidemiological zone but as a single SPS zone. But it's already the case that for live animals, there are checks at Larne and Belfast, and so we'll be building on the existing systems that we have there in order to ensure that checks are appropriate. And it is the case, of course, that physical checks on products of animal origin apply only to a small proportion of those goods.
But what about other goods that are bound for the Republic of Ireland from Scotland? Where do the checks on those goods take place?
Well, if they're bound for the Republic of Ireland, then it will be the case that customs procedures will be conducted, and we believe that they can be conducted electronically as the goods make their way there. But it is the case that the overwhelming majority of trade between the UK and Northern Ireland is intra-UK, as it were, reinforcing the importance of the United Kingdom's internal market and the fact that we all benefit from those economic, social and cultural ties.
Yeah. I'm talking about the proportion of goods that are going to the Republic of Ireland, and we've had a look at the custom. We've had a look at the electronic methods that are already in place at the ferry terminal, and it's quite clear that although many of the containers that are going across to Northern Ireland are marked, that there are containers where you do need to investigate, and so you would need additional electronic infrastructure if you didn't get a deal for goods going to the south of Ireland.
Well, I'd be grateful for the detail that the committee would wish to provide on that, but I think that the fears that some have expressed, I believe, are misplaced. But of course, I'd be very, very grateful for any documentation that the committee wished to share to look at trade flows, to look at specific goods, and to see if there are any additional concerns that we can safely address through the work of HMRC.
Yeah, because the withdrawal agreement obviously absolutely forbids any checks apart from but you mentioned animal ones, but any new checks on the island of Ireland would would not be acceptable in terms of the withdrawal agreement.
Indeed, the reason why the protocol exists is to safeguard the gains of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and to ensure that we can have unfettered access for goods circulating within the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland stays within the United Kingdom customs territory, but it also enables provisions which ensure that there need be no physical infrastructure at the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
Thank you very much for that, and we'll certainly share any evidence that we have gathered with you, Mr Gove. And that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session. Can I take the opportunity to thank Mr Gove for his evidence today and what has been an extremely helpful evidence session as the committee continues to scrutinise the future relationship negotiations. And we look forward to taking evidence from Mr Gove later in the year to assess whether progress has been made in these negotiations, which are, of course, of critical importance to Scotland. So thank you very much, Mr Gove. The committee will consider the evidence heard in private shortly, and that concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. I will allow a couple of minutes for members to have a comfort break before we resume in private session. Thank you very much.